He was the embodiment of American masculinity, a Hollywood dream carved in stone and sold to the public as the ultimate leading man. But behind the chiseled jawline and charming smile of Rock Hudson was a man living in constant fear, not of failure, but of being found out. In the golden age of Hollywood, being gay wasn't just taboo, it was career suicide. Studios had strict moral clauses, publicists controlled every headline, and actors had to perform off-screen as much as they did on-screen. Rock Hudson's life became a double performance, one for the cameras and one behind closed doors. Born Roy Harold Scherer Jr. in Illinois, he was discovered and molded into Rock Hudson by powerful Hollywood agent Henry Wilson. Wilson not only gave him a new name, but a whole new identity, one that oozed heterosexual fantasy. As Hudson's career soared with romantic leads in films like Magnificent Obsession and Pillow Talk, rumors began to swirl behind the scenes. Industry insiders whispered about his close relationships with male companions, but the studio machine worked overtime to keep his image intact. Fake relationships with actresses were staged, press stories were carefully planted, and photos were destroyed before they could surface. One of Hudson's most talked-about romances was with his close friend and roommate Lee Garlington, a man he loved quietly and privately, while the world believed he was courting starlets. Their relationship was intense but restrained, always shadowed by the looming threat of exposure. Garlington would later describe how they used back doors, separate cars, and fake names, all to keep the truth hidden. Even at the height of his fame, Hudson couldn't live openly. The 1950s and 1960s weren't just unkind to gay men. They were dangerous. The FBI investigated suspected homosexuals, newspapers outed actors in salacious columns, and moral watchdogs demanded purity from public figures. Hudson played his part with painful precision. He married Phyllis Gates, Wilson's secretary, in what many believe was a calculated move to quiet speculation. The marriage lasted just 3 years, and Phyllis herself would later claim she knew the truth. Despite the facade, Hudson found ways to live parts of his truth. He hosted discreet gatherings in his mansion, attended underground gay bars, and maintained a small circle of trusted friends who accepted him without judgment. Yet the pressure of maintaining a false identity took its toll. Hudson became increasingly withdrawn in his later years, retreating from the spotlight as the weight of secrets grew heavier. But everything changed in 1985 when Rock Hudson made headlines around the world, not for a new movie, but for revealing that he had AIDS. It was a moment that shattered the silence. Hudson became the first major celebrity to publicly acknowledge the disease, and by extension, his sexuality. Though he never gave a formal coming-out statement, the truth was undeniable. The revelation sent shockwaves through Hollywood and marked a turning point in public awareness of AIDS and homosexuality. His confession, whether intentional or not, humanized a crisis that had long been stigmatized. And for the millions of gay men living in secrecy, Hudson's silent courage gave them a glimmer of visibility. When he died later that year, tributes poured in not just for the actor, but for the man who had finally, if only at the end, lived his truth. Rock Hudson's story isn't just about fame, secrecy, or tragedy. It's about resilience in a time when being yourself could cost you everything. He wasn't just a leading man, he was a symbol of how far someone would go to protect who they really were. And now, decades later, his legacy is not only found in film reels, but in the slow dismantling of the shame he was forced to carry alone. He was known for his effortless charm, his dazzling smile, and a screen presence that made audiences swoon. But Tab Hunter's life was anything but carefree. Beneath the golden boy image carefully crafted by the studio system, he lived with a secret that could have destroyed everything he had worked for. Born Arthur Andrew Kelm, Tab Hunter was transformed into the quintessential 1950s heartthrob, a blonde, blue-eyed icon of American masculinity. He starred in romantic dramas and beachside comedies, paired on-screen with some of the most desirable actresses of the day. To the public, he was the all-American dream. To Hollywood, he was marketable perfection. But in private, Tab Hunter was a man constantly dodging the truth. From a young age, he knew he was different. As he began navigating Hollywood's social circles, he also began exploring his identity, cautiously, carefully, and always under threat. The pressure to conform to a heterosexual persona was immense. The tabloids were always watching, and scandal magazines like Confidential would stop at nothing to destroy careers. When a rival studio leaked information about Hunter attending a party that was raided by police, the fear of exposure became very real. It didn't matter how talented you were. If you were found out, you were finished. Tab knew this, and so he played the game. He dated high-profile actresses like Natalie Wood, their relationships heavily publicized, staged by studios to reinforce the illusion. But behind the headlines, Hunter was deeply involved in a long-term relationship with figure skater Ronnie Robertson and later with actor Anthony Perkins. Their relationship was kept so hidden that many close to them didn't even know it existed. They would arrange to meet in secret, staying in separate hotel rooms, using coded language to communicate, always watching their backs. Hunter later admitted that the secrecy was suffocating. Living a double life made him feel like he was constantly on trial, constantly lying to everyone, his fans, his colleagues, even himself. And yet, he loved. He loved fiercely, passionately, even if it had to be from the shadows. Acting, for Hunter, was a mask that helped him survive. He could smile for the cameras, hit his mark, deliver lines, and charm audiences, all while concealing his true self. That contradiction took a toll. The fear of being outed loomed over every moment of his career. As he aged and the public's obsession shifted to new stars, Hunter began to disappear from the spotlight. But in that space, he found something else: honesty. In 2005, he released a memoir titled Tab Hunter Confidential, where he finally told the truth. He wrote about his love life, his struggles, and the impossible choice he faced between being who he was and preserving his career. The book was not just a tell-all, it was a cathartic act of liberation. For the first time, Tab Hunter didn't have to hide. His story resonated with people around the world, especially older gay men who had endured similar silences. Tab had survived the Hollywood machine, the whispers, the threats, and the loneliness. And by speaking out, he reclaimed the narrative that had been stolen from him decades earlier. He spent his final years in a peaceful relationship with his partner, Alan Glazer, whom he loved openly and without apology. Their bond, lasting over 30 years, was a quiet rebellion against the industry that once forced him to lie. Tab Hunter didn't just outlive the system that tried to erase his truth. He helped dismantle it. Today, his name may not be as instantly recognizable as it once was, but his courage paved the way for future generations of actors to live freely. In a time when being gay was considered shameful, Hunter managed to carry himself with grace, grit, and a strength that remained invisible to most. But now we remember him not just for his beauty or his films, but for the quiet defiance that made him truly legendary. He was the silver screen's tortured soul, a master of emotional depth who captivated audiences with brooding eyes and fragile intensity. But Montgomery Clift wasn't just acting when he played sensitive, conflicted characters. He was channeling the inner chaos of a man torn between authenticity and survival. In the golden age of Hollywood, being openly gay was more than controversial. It was career-ending. And for Clift, a man both adored and scrutinized by the public, this meant living in a prison built from fear, secrecy, and unbearable loneliness. Born into privilege in Omaha, Nebraska, Montgomery Clift was no stranger to high society, but it was on the stage that he truly found his calling. After earning acclaim in Broadway productions, he transitioned into film and quickly made his mark. Roles in A Place in the Sun, From Here to Eternity, and Judgment at Nuremberg established him as one of the greatest actors of his generation. He didn't conform to the typical Hollywood mold. He was intellectual, introspective, vulnerable, and audiences loved him for it. But behind that celebrated vulnerability was a man who was constantly hiding. Clift was romantically involved with both men and women, but his deepest emotional connections were often with men, something he could never reveal publicly. His sexuality was an open secret among insiders, but to the rest of the world, he was expected to play the role of a straight, leading man, a fantasy for female fans. Studio executives arranged dates with actresses. Gossip columnists were paid off. Friends were instructed to cover for him. Every photo taken, every headline printed, had to reinforce the illusion. Even his best friend Elizabeth Taylor, who would become one of his fiercest protectors, knew the rules of the game. Montgomery Clift's private life was an endless performance, one that slowly tore him apart. The pressure mounted, and it exploded in 1956 when Clift suffered a near-fatal car crash after leaving a party at Taylor's home. The accident shattered his face, forcing extensive surgeries and leaving permanent scars. Physically and emotionally, he was never the same. The Hollywood heartthrob was suddenly damaged, and the industry turned cold. He spiraled into addiction, depression, and paranoia. The man once hailed as Marlon Brando's equal became a ghost of his former self. But Clift kept working. In films like The Misfits and The Defector, his brilliance still flickered through the pain, though now laced with a visible sadness that only deepened the tragedy. Through it all, he remained silent about his truth, not because he was ashamed, but because the world wasn't ready. He was forced to choose between love and livelihood, and the system made that choice for him. In his final years, Clift lived a quiet, reclusive life, his once bright star dimmed by years of hiding. He passed away at just 45, found alone in his Manhattan townhouse. The official cause was a heart attack, but those who knew him best understood that it was the years of emotional suppression that ultimately broke him. It wasn't until decades later that the full picture of Clift's life began to emerge. Biographies revealed his romantic letters, interviews hinted at long-lost loves, and historians connected the dots the studios had tried so hard to erase. And what emerged was not a scandal, but a tragedy. A brilliant actor destroyed not by his identity, but by the world's refusal to accept it. Today, Montgomery Clift is remembered not just as a gifted performer, but as a man who carried the unbearable weight of invisibility. His story stands as a stark reminder of what it meant to be gay in Hollywood's golden age, to be everything the world wanted, except yourself. And though he never spoke his truth aloud, it lives on in every performance, every glance, every pause, a silent rebellion against a system that demanded silence. Clift's pain gave his character soul, but it came at a cost no one should have had to pay. He was Hollywood royalty, a man whose suave charisma and debonair style made him one of the most beloved actors of the 20th century, but behind the tailored suits and charming smile, Cary Grant lived a life of complex duality. While millions of fans adored his on-screen romances with some of the most famous actresses of his time, the truth of Grant's personal life was far more enigmatic. Born Archibald Leach in Bristol, England, he reinvented himself in America, trading in his modest beginnings for the glamour of Hollywood. The transformation was total, in voice, in demeanor, in name. But it also came with a steep price, the suppression of his true self. From the 1930s through the 1960s, Grant became synonymous with sophistication, starring in iconic films like North by Northwest, To Catch a Thief, and Bringing Up Baby. His leading man status was unquestionable, and his image as the ideal heterosexual partner was crafted with almost surgical precision. Yet behind the scenes, whispers circulated for decades about his longtime companionship with fellow actor Randolph Scott. The two met in the early 1930s while filming Hot Saturday and soon became inseparable. They lived together in a shared mansion in Malibu for years, prompting rumors of a romantic relationship that the studios desperately tried to bury. Press photos often showed them cooking together, lounging by the pool, or laughing over breakfast. Domestic snapshots that looked more like a married couple than mere roommates. Studio publicists, uncomfortable with the speculation, forced Grant into carefully orchestrated relationships with actresses. He would eventually marry 5 times, but none of these marriages lasted. His first wife, Virginia Sherrill, reportedly walked in on Grant and Scott in an intimate moment, leading to their swift divorce. Each subsequent relationship appeared increasingly performative, as if fulfilling a role rather than reflecting real passion. The industry went to great lengths to keep Grant's true orientation ambiguous. Gossip magazines were bribed or threatened, reporters were fed distractions, and fans were bombarded with stories of his supposed affairs with leading ladies. Still, insiders and close friends knew the truth, and so did Grant. But he was trapped in an era that offered no safety net for openness. Coming out was not an option. Careers had been destroyed for less, and Grant had too much to lose. His charm, his fame, his legacy, all hinged on the maintenance of the illusion. And so he lived in a limbo, loving in secret and performing in public. Grant's relationship with Randolph Scott endured, despite the pressure and the public scrutiny. Though the two never publicly acknowledged being romantically involved, their bond was undeniable. Scott would later marry, but remained close to Grant until the end. After their time together ended, Grant continued to build his Hollywood empire, all while navigating a world that refused to accept his full identity. As he aged, he distanced himself from Hollywood and retreated into a more private life, eventually retiring from acting. In his later years, he became more reflective, but never publicly addressed the rumors. He maintained a dignified silence, one that both protected and imprisoned him. Cary Grant passed away in 1986, taking with him a lifetime of carefully guarded secrets. But in the decades since, biographies, personal letters, and insider accounts have painted a picture of a man who was far more complex and far more vulnerable than his public persona suggested. His story is not one of scandal, but of survival. A man who gave the world elegance and humor, all while carrying the weight of a truth he could never fully share. Today, Grant's legacy is celebrated not just for the roles he played, but for the humanity he embodied, flawed, fearful, and quietly courageous. His life remains a haunting example of how even the most beloved icons can be prisoners of the time they lived in, forced to wear a mask for the sake of applause. But behind that mask was a man who loved deeply, lived discreetly, and left a mark far beyond the screen. He was a symbol of masculinity, the tough guy with the iconic mustache and grizzled demeanor that made audiences believe he was born for the role of the rugged hero. But Rock Hudson's story is perhaps the most well-known and heartbreaking example of the price of hiding one's true identity in old Hollywood. Born Roy Harold Scherer Jr., Hudson arrived in Hollywood with little more than a handsome face and a dream. He was quickly noticed by talent scouts who recognized his potential and polished him into a leading man. The studio transformed him into Rock Hudson, a name meant to echo strength and stability, and his image was carefully crafted to represent the pinnacle of American manhood. He became the poster boy for straight romance in the 1950s and 60s, starring opposite Doris Day in a string of popular romantic comedies and captivating female audiences across the world. But behind closed doors, the reality was very different. From the start of his career, Hudson knew that being openly gay would be the end of everything. The studio system at the time had zero tolerance for deviation from the heterosexual fantasy they sold to the public. So Hudson played along. He went on fake dates, was seen in public with female co-stars, and even entered into a short-lived marriage with his agent's secretary to quash rumors. All of it was a performance, one for survival, not stardom. Friends and insiders knew the truth. Hudson maintained a circle of trusted companions and lived as openly as he could in private, throwing lavish parties at his home that were often filled with other closeted celebrities. But even within that circle, there was fear. Fear of being outed, fear of betrayal, fear of losing everything. Hudson spent decades balancing the persona of the charming heartthrob with the painful reality of his double life. He never spoke publicly about his relationships, and every romantic entanglement had to be hidden, every affectionate gesture disguised. He lived with the constant burden of being adored by a public that only loved the illusion. But it was in the 1980s that Hudson's life took a tragic and historic turn. In 1984, he was diagnosed with AIDS, a disease that at the time was widely misunderstood and deeply stigmatized. For months, he continued to work and appear in public, refusing to acknowledge the illness, even as his body began to weaken. Eventually, though, the truth could no longer be hidden. In 1985, Rock Hudson became the first major public figure to announce he had AIDS. It was a revelation that sent shockwaves through the world. Suddenly, the fantasy was shattered. The man who had once represented the ultimate heterosexual dream was now the face of a disease the world was desperate to ignore. And his sexuality was no longer a rumor but a tragic truth. The reaction was mixed. Some fans were shocked, others angry, but many were deeply moved. Hudson's announcement humanized a crisis that had been shrouded in silence and shame. His courage to come forward, even when he was gravely ill, changed the conversation around AIDS and homosexuality. Politicians were forced to respond, public funding increased, and countless lives were affected by the awareness Hudson's story brought. In his final days, Hudson was cared for by close friends and confidants who stood by him despite the storm. He died in October 1985 at the age of 59, leaving behind a legacy that went far beyond the movies. His death marked a turning point in both the public's understanding of AIDS and Hollywood's treatment of gay actors. In many ways, Rock Hudson was a martyr of the system, a man who gave everything to uphold a lie he never wanted to tell. But in his final act, he told the truth, and that truth saved lives. Today, his name is not just associated with classic films or swoon-worthy romances, but with bravery, vulnerability, and change. He didn't get to live openly, but in dying honestly, he helped make it possible for others to do so. His story is a solemn reminder of the price paid by so many for simply being themselves in an industry built on illusion.